The last passenger stepped off the afternoon train into the dusty heat of Delta, Colorado, clutching a worn leather suitcase with white-knuckled fingers. Margaret Newsom stood frozen on the platform, her blue calico dress swaying gently in the hot summer breeze as her eyes darted frantically from face to face. This wasn't what she had expected. This wasn't what she had been promised. The station bustled with activity around her cowboys loading cattle, merchants receiving shipments, miners heading to the silver mines up north. Margaret tried to steady her breathing as panic rose in her chest. The letters from William Blackstone had described a prosperous ranch, a comfortable home, a respectable husband. But he wasn't here to meet her, and the crude sketch he'd sent looked nothing like the ramshackle buildings she could see from the station. Her throat tightened as she fought back tears. 22 years old, and already she'd made the worst mistake of her life, traveling 1,500 miles from Boston on the promise of a better future. The station agent had called the last arrival, and passengers had cleared, leaving her conspicuously alone on the wooden platform. "Are you all right, miss?" Margaret startled at the deep voice beside her. A tall man in worn denim and a dust-covered hat stood a respectful distance away. His face was sun-bronzed and weather-lined, but his eyes were kind under the brim of his hat. She began, her voice failing as she tried to compose herself. "I'm waiting for someone." "William Blackstone?" the stranger asked, his expression changing subtly. Margaret's breath caught. "Yes. Do you know him?" The man removed his hat, revealing sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the temples. "My name is Patrick Evans. I run the Crossbar Ranch about 8 miles south of town." He hesitated. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news about Mr. Blackstone." The blood drained from Margaret's face. "Has something happened to him?" Patrick Evans shifted uncomfortably. "Madam, William Blackstone passed away 3 weeks ago. Influenza took him quick. I'm sorry you weren't notified." Margaret swayed, her vision blurring at the edges. The stranger Patrick moved quickly, taking her elbow to steady her. "Easy now," he said gently. "Let's get you sitting down." He guided her to a bench against the station wall, setting her suitcase beside her. Margaret sank down, her mind spinning with this devastating news. She had no money for a return ticket, no family waiting for her back east, and now no husband-to-be. "I don't understand," she whispered. "I received a letter from him just before I left Boston." Patrick crouched before her, balancing on his heels. "Mail takes time out here." "He likely wrote it before he took ill." Margaret pressed trembling fingers to her lips. "What am I to do now?" The cowboy studied her for a long moment, his green eyes thoughtful. "Did you have any other arrangements? Anyone else you might contact?" She shook her head. "I was an orphan, Mr. Evans. I worked as a seamstress in Boston, but She faltered, embarrassed to admit the desperation that had led her to answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride. Understanding crossed his face. "You came west for a fresh start." "Yes." The word came out as barely more than a whisper. Patrick rose to his full height, looking around the nearly empty platform. "Miss Newsom, Margaret Newsom, Miss Newsom, I can't in good conscience leave you stranded here. Delta's a decent town, but it's no place for a lady alone with no prospects." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I have a proposition for you. It's not ideal, but it might help us both." Margaret looked up warily, all too aware of what propositions could entail for women in desperate circumstances. Seeing her expression, Patrick quickly added, "Nothing improper, Miss Newsom. My sister, Emma, runs the household at Crossbar. She's expecting a child in a few months and could use help with the house. I can offer you room and board and a modest wage until you decide what you want to do." Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by suspicion. Why would you help me? You don't know anything about me." Patrick replaced his hat, adjusting it against the sun. "I knew William. Not well, but enough to know he wouldn't want the woman he intended to marry left stranded. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "Emma will have my hide if I leave you here." Margaret weighed her options, which were painfully few. "I would be most grateful for your assistance, Mr. Evans, but I want to be clear that this is a temporary arrangement until I can find suitable employment in town." "Understood," he nodded, reaching for her suitcase. "My wagon's just across the street. We should get moving if we want to reach the ranch before dark." As they crossed the dusty main street, Margaret felt eyes following her. A small group of men outside the saloon watched them pass, their expressions ranging from curious to predatory. She instinctively moved closer to Patrick. "Don't mind them," he said quietly. "Word travels fast in small towns. Everyone's curious about the new arrival." His wagon was simple but well-maintained, with 2 strong chestnut horses waiting patiently in the afternoon heat. Patrick loaded her suitcase in the back and offered his hand to help her up to the seat. "It's a rough ride," he warned as she settled beside him. "These roads weren't made for comfort." Margaret smoothed her skirts, trying to appear more composed than she felt. "I'm tougher than I look, Mr. Evans." This earned her a genuine smile. "I don't doubt that, Miss Newsom. Anyone brave enough to travel across the country to marry a man she's never met has plenty of grit." The wagon lurched forward as Patrick flicked the reins, and Margaret grabbed the seat to steady herself. As they left the small town behind, the vastness of the western landscape opened before them, rolling foothills rising to distant mountains, the land painted in shades of gold and rust under the late summer sun. "It's beautiful," Margaret murmured, momentarily forgetting her troubles. "Different from Boston, I imagine." "Very. Everything there is so, contained, buildings and walls and fences everywhere." She gestured to the open landscape. "This feels like freedom." Patrick glanced at her with newfound interest. "Most Easterners find it terrifying. Too much space, too much sky. Perhaps I'm not like most Easterners." "Perhaps not," he agreed, turning his attention back to the road. As the wagon jostled along, Margaret tried to process the rapid changes in her circumstances. Just this morning, she had been preparing to meet her future husband. Now that future had vanished, replaced by uncertainty and the kindness of a stranger. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, partly to distract herself from her worries. Pride warmed Patrick's voice. "Crossbar's been in my family for nearly 20 years. My father came west in '49 looking for gold but found good grazing land instead. He built it up from nothing, ran cattle across 3 counties. His expression sobered. "When he and my mother died 5 years ago, the ranch came to me and my sister." "I'm sorry for your loss," Margaret said softly. "It must have been difficult." "It was, still is some days." He adjusted his hat against the setting sun. "But we've managed to keep it going, even expanded some. Got about 60 head of cattle now, decent grazing land, good water rights. And it's just you and your sister, and her husband Thomas. Good man. Fought for the Union in the war, came west afterward looking for peace. We've got 3 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse, Miguel, Caleb, and Joe. Decent fellows, all of them." The landscape gradually changed as they traveled, rolling hills giving way to more rugged terrain dotted with scrub oak and pinyon pine. The road narrowed, following the course of a stream that glinted silver in the fading light. "Nearly there," Patrick said as they crested a rise. The valley below cradled a sprawling ranch, a large main house built of timber and local stone, a substantial barn, corrals, and several outbuildings. Smoke curled lazily from the house's chimney, and Margaret could see cattle grazing in fenced pastures that stretched toward the foothills. "It's larger than I expected," she admitted as they descended into the valley. "We've been fortunate." There was no boasting in his tone, just quiet satisfaction. The last few years have been good for cattle prices. As they approached the ranch yard, a woman emerged onto the porch of the main house. Even from a distance, Margaret could see her advanced pregnancy. Patrick guided the wagon to a stop near the house and jumped down. "That's Emma," he said, offering Margaret his hand to help her descend. "Patrick Evans," the woman called, one hand supporting her back as she made her way down the porch steps. "You were supposed to be back hours ago." Thomas was about to ride out looking for. She stopped short, noticing Margaret for the first time. "Who's this?" "Emma, this is Miss Margaret Newsom," Patrick said, retrieving Margaret's suitcase from the wagon. "Miss Newsom, my sister, Emma Larson." Emma's eyes widened with recognition. "You're William Blackstone's bride," Margaret felt her face flush. "I was to be, yes. Your brother informed me of Mr. Blackstone's passing." Emma's expression softened immediately. "Oh, you poor dear, you must be devastated." She shot her brother a questioning look. "Patrick." "Miss Newsom has no family or connections here," he explained. "I offered her a position helping around the house, at least until the baby comes. I thought maybe after that she might find work in town if she wishes." Emma studied Margaret for a moment, then nodded decisively. "Well, you're certainly welcome here, and heaven knows I could use the help." She gestured to her swollen belly with a rueful smile. "This little one has me moving like an old wagon with a broken wheel." Margaret returned the smile, grateful for the woman's warm reception. "Thank you, Mrs. Larson. I'm happy to earn my keep. It's Emma, please. Come inside. You must be exhausted after your journey." She ushered Margaret toward the house, adding over her shoulder, "Patrick, have Miguel take care of the horses, then wash up for supper. It's nearly ready." The interior of the ranch house surprised Margaret with its comfort and touches of refinement. The main room combined a sitting area with a dining space, centered around a large stone fireplace. Braided rugs softened the wooden floors, and curtains of cheerful calico framed the windows. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, comfortable, and far more civilized than she had expected of a Western ranch. Emma showed her to a small but pleasant bedroom off the main hallway. "It's not much," she apologized, "but it's private and the mattress is new last year." "It's lovely," Margaret assured her, setting down her suitcase. After weeks of train travel and boarding houses, the simple room with its iron bedstead and patchwork quilt looked like heaven. "There's water in the pitcher if you'd like to freshen up," Emma said. "Supper's in half an hour." "Don't worry about changing, we're not formal here." Left alone, Margaret sank onto the bed, the events of the day finally overwhelming her. She buried her face in her hands and allowed herself a few quiet sobs. She had come west with such hope, such determination to build a new life. Now everything was uncertain again. But as the tears subsided, Margaret felt a familiar resolve hardening within her. She had survived an orphanage, had supported herself in Boston when many said a woman couldn't. She would survive this too. Wiping her eyes, she moved to the wash basin and began to prepare for supper with her unexpected hosts. In the dining room, Margaret found herself seated between Patrick and a solidly built man with a neatly trimmed beard whom Emma introduced as her husband, Thomas. The meal was simple but abundant: roasted chicken, potatoes, early summer vegetables, and fresh bread. "So, Miss Newsom," Thomas said as they began to eat, "Patrick tells us you're from Boston." "Yes, though I was born in New York. My parents died when I was 8 and I was sent to an orphanage in Boston." "And you were a seamstress there?" Emma asked. Margaret nodded. "For a dress shop on Tremont Street. I was lucky many orphans end up in factories or worse, but I showed skill with a needle early on. That's a fortunate talent, Emma said appreciatively. Especially out here where ready-made clothing is scarce and expensive. If you don't mind my asking, Thomas ventured, how did you come to correspond with William Blackstone? Margaret hesitated, conscious of Patrick's attentive silence beside her. There was an advertisement in a Boston newspaper. Rancher seeks bride of good character for companionable marriage. I wrote to the listed address, and Mr. Blackstone replied. She looked down at her plate. We exchanged several letters over the course of a year. He seemed kind, honorable he was, Patrick confirmed quietly. A solitary man but respected in the community. How did you know him? Margaret asked. Our ranches adjoin at the south boundary. We shared water rights on Cottonwood Creek. He ran sheep mostly, did well with them. Emma leaned forward, her expression concerned. Have you thought about what you'll do now, Margaret? About the Blackstone property, I mean. Margaret blinked in confusion. The property? I don't understand. The three exchanged glances. Miss Newsom, Patrick said carefully, if you and William were legally betrothed and he named you in his will, you might have claim to his ranch. Margaret set down her fork, stunned. But we weren't married. I never even met him. It depends on the wording of his agreements, Thomas explained. Some mail order arrangements include legal provisions that take effect once the bride arrives, even if the ceremony hasn't happened. I had no idea, Margaret whispered. He never mentioned any such arrangement in his letters. Judge Harmon in town handled William's affairs, Patrick said. We can ride in tomorrow and speak with him if you'd like. Margaret nodded slowly, trying to process this unexpected possibility. Yes, I would appreciate that. The conversation moved to other topics as the meal continued, but Margaret found her thoughts returning to the idea of inheriting William Blackstone's ranch. If it were true, it would completely change her circumstances. She would have property, independence, a home of her own. The very things she had dreamed of when leaving Boston. But as she glanced at Patrick Evans, who was describing the cattle drive he was planning for the fall, she felt an unexpected twist of uncertainty. The kindness he and his family had shown her, with no expectation of return, had touched her deeply. And something about the quiet strength in his voice, the integrity evident in his actions, stirred feelings she hadn't anticipated. After supper, while Emma and Thomas retired to the porch, Patrick showed Margaret around the main grounds of the ranch, pointing out the barn, corrals, smokehouse, and other essential buildings as the last light faded from the sky. It's a working ranch, he explained as they walked. Not much for show, but everything has its purpose. Margaret watched as he nodded to one of the ranch hands crossing the yard. You seem to have built a good life here. We've been lucky, he said, leading her toward a fenced garden behind the house. And we've worked hard. That counts for more than luck out here. I understand hard work, Margaret said, remembering the endless hours bent over fine stitching in the dim light of the dress shop. But I've never done ranch work. I'm not sure I'd be much use to Emma beyond basic housekeeping. Patrick stopped by the garden gate, turning to face her in the deepening twilight. Everyone starts somewhere, Miss Newsom, and people adapt. You'd be surprised what you can learn when you need to. His confidence in her abilities, however theoretical, warmed something inside her. Thank you for that, and for everything today. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been at the station. A faint smile crossed his face. I wasn't supposed to be there. I was meant to pick up supplies and head straight back. But there was a problem with an order, and I had to wait for the afternoon train to bring the missing parts. A fortunate coincidence, then. Maybe. His gaze held hers for a moment longer than necessary, or maybe some things happen for a reason. The night air suddenly felt charged with something Margaret couldn't name. She looked away first, gesturing to the neat rows of vegetables in the garden. Did Emma plant all this herself? Mostly. It's her pride and joy, though she's had to let Thomas and me help more lately. He opened the gate for her. We should head back. Morning comes early on a ranch, and we'll need to make an early start to town if we're to see Judge Harmon. As they walked back to the house, Margaret found herself wondering what Patrick had meant by, "Some things happen for a reason." Was he merely being philosophical, or had there been something more personal in his comments? She pushed the thought aside. She was a stranger here, dependent on his family's charity. Any feelings beyond gratitude would be inappropriate and likely unrequited. Tomorrow, she would focus on practical matters and her uncertain future. But as she prepared for bed in the small, comfortable room, Margaret couldn't help glancing out the window toward the bunkhouse where Patrick stayed. A light still burned in one window, and she wondered if he, too, was thinking about their unexpected meeting and what tomorrow might bring. Dawn broke early and clear over the ranch, painting the distant mountains with golden light. Margaret had been awake since before sunrise, her sleep disturbed by dreams of Boston and trains that never reached their destinations. She dressed in her second-best dress, a practical navy blue with white piping, and carefully arranged her hair before joining the household for breakfast. The kitchen was already busy when she entered. Emma stood at the stove despite her condition, frying bacon and eggs while Thomas set the large table. Through the window, Margaret could see the ranch hands gathering at the bunkhouse door, preparing for their day's work. "Good morning," Emma greeted her cheerfully. "Did you sleep well?" "Very well, thank you," Margaret fibbed, not wanting to seem ungrateful. "Can I help with breakfast? You could bring the coffee to the table. Patrick should be in any minute." "He's been up since before dawn, checking on a mare that's about to foal." As if summoned by his name, Patrick appeared in the doorway, looking freshly washed but tired. His eyes brightened slightly when he saw Margaret. "Miss Newsom, I trust you're rested." "Yes, thank you," she replied, carrying the heavy coffee pot to the table. "I understand we're riding to town today. After breakfast, if that suits you. It's about an hour each way." Breakfast was a heartier affair than Margaret was accustomed to, with eggs, bacon, biscuits, and gravy. The conversation flowed easily among the family members, with Margaret occasionally drawn in with questions about Boston or her journey west. "I've never been east of the Mississippi," Emma confessed as she passed the biscuits. "What's it like, living in such a big city?" Margaret considered the question. "Crowded, noisy, but also exciting in its way. There are theaters and museums, concerts and lectures. Of course, I rarely had time or money to enjoy such things, but just knowing they were there was something." "Do you miss it?" Thomas asked. Margaret thought about the cramped boarding house where she'd lived, the smoky air, the constant press of people. "Not as much as I expected to," she admitted. "There's something about the openness here that feels liberating. It gets into your blood," Patrick said, meeting her eyes briefly. "The space, the freedom, makes it hard to imagine living any other way." After breakfast, Patrick went to saddle horses while Margaret gathered her papers, the letters from William Blackstone, the train tickets, the official document that had confirmed their arrangement. If there was any legal claim to be made, these would be her evidence. Emma helped her choose a riding skirt from her own wardrobe, though the pregnant woman's clothes were loose on Margaret's slimmer frame. "It's not fashionable," Emma apologized, helping Margaret pin the waistband, "but it's practical for riding. No lady wants to arrive in town with a dress full of dust and horse hair." When Margaret emerged from the house, Patrick was waiting with 2 horses, a gentle-looking bay mare for her and a taller chestnut gelding for himself. He helped her mount, his hands strong and sure at her waist, and then swung easily into his own saddle. "Ready?" he asked, gathering his reins. Margaret nodded, trying to conceal her nervousness. She had ridden before, but rarely, and never Western style. The saddle felt different, larger, and more secure than the side saddles she had used in Boston. "Just relax and let Daisy do the work," Patrick advised, seeing her tension. "She knows the way." The morning was pleasant for riding, with a light breeze tempering the summer heat as they followed a well-worn trail toward town. Margaret gradually relaxed as Daisy proved to be exactly as gentle as promised, walking steadily alongside Patrick's mount. "May I ask you something, Miss Newsom?" Patrick said after they had ridden in companionable silence for a while. "Of course. What did you hope to find out here? When you agreed to marry William, I mean." The question caught her off guard with its directness. "I'm not sure I know how to answer that. I'm sorry if I've overstepped. No, it's a fair question." She watched a hawk circle lazily overhead as she gathered her thoughts. "I wanted what most people want, I suppose. A home, security, perhaps eventually children. But mostly, I wanted a chance to build something of my own, something that couldn't be taken away." Patrick nodded thoughtfully. "And if Judge Harmon confirms you've inherited William's ranch, would you stay and run it? I honestly don't know. I've never even seen it." She gave him a sidelong glance. "Is that what you're worried about? Having an inexperienced neighbor who knows nothing about ranching?" A smile tugged at his lips. "It crossed my mind. Ranching's not easy even for those born to it. I'm a quick learner, Mr. Evans. I don't doubt that. But there's a difference between learning to sew a fine stitch and learning to manage livestock, land, water rights, and ranch hands." His expression turned more serious. "And the Blackstone place needs work. William was getting on in years, and some things have been neglected." "Are you trying to discourage me?" "I'm trying to be honest with you. You seem like a woman who prefers hard truths to comfortable lies." Margaret couldn't argue with that assessment. "Well, let's see what Judge Harmon has to say before I make any plans." They reached Delta by mid-morning, the small town more active than it had been the previous afternoon. Wagons lined the main street, and people moved purposefully between the various businesses: the general store, the smithy, the bank, the hotel, and the inevitable saloon. Patrick helped Margaret dismount in front of a small but well-maintained building with Law Office H. Harmon, Judge and Attorney, painted on the window. He tied their horses to the hitching post and held the door for her. Inside, a clerk looked up from his paperwork. "Mr. Evans." "What brings you to town today?" "Need to see Judge Harmon, Billy. It's about William Blackstone's estate." The clerk's eyes shifted to Margaret with undisguised curiosity. "I'll see if he's available." A few minutes later, they were ushered into a book-lined office where a distinguished older man with silver hair and spectacles rose to greet them. "Patrick Evans. Didn't expect to see you before the cattle auction next month." The judge extended his hand to Patrick, then turned a questioning gaze to Margaret. "Judge Harmon, this is Miss Margaret Newsom," Patrick introduced her. "She arrived from Boston yesterday expecting to marry William Blackstone." Harmon's eyebrows shot up. "I see. Please sit down, both of you." He settled behind his desk, studying Margaret with keen interest. "I wasn't aware William had made such arrangements. We had been corresponding for over a year," Margaret explained, retrieving the letters from her reticule. "These were his communications to me." The judge accepted the letters, examining them carefully. "These appear to be in William's hand, certainly. And you say you came west specifically to marry him?" "Yes, we had an agreement." She hesitated. Mr. Evans suggested that such an agreement might have legal implications regarding Mr. Blackstone's property, now that he's deceased. Judge Harmon leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "It's an unusual situation, but not unprecedented. William Blackstone died intestate, that is, without a formal will. Under normal circumstances, his property would revert to next of kin. Does he have any? Patrick asked. None that we've been able to locate. No siblings, no children, parents long deceased. The judge picked up one of the letters again. These letters constitute a clear intent to marry. Miss Newsom has fulfilled her part of the agreement by traveling here as specified. Under territorial law, that could indeed establish her claim as his intended spouse. Margaret's heart raced. Are you saying the ranch is mine? I'm saying you have a reasonable claim to it. I would need to file papers with the territorial court, but I believe they would rule in your favor. He looked at her over his spectacles. However, I must caution you. The Blackstone Ranch is not in good condition. The sheep have been sold off, the buildings need repair, and there are debts to be settled. Patrick shifted in his seat. How bad are the debts, Judge? Not ruinous, but substantial. William borrowed against future wool yields last winter. With no wool to sell and no sheep left, those notes have come due. Margaret felt her hopes deflating. So even if I inherit the ranch, I'd be inheriting debts I can't pay. Unless you can find a way to make the ranch productive quickly, yes. Patrick cleared his throat. Judge, if I may, what if Miss Newsom sold the ranch? Would the proceeds cover the debts? Judge Harmon considered this. Possibly. Land values have been rising in the area, but finding a buyer quickly might be difficult. Margaret looked between the two men, feeling suddenly like a pawn in a game she didn't understand. I haven't even seen this property yet. I'm not ready to make decisions about selling it. Of course, Patrick said quickly. Judge Harmon is just outlining your options. The judge nodded. Precisely. I suggest we proceed with establishing your claim, Miss Newsom. That will take several weeks. In the meantime, you can visit the property, assess its condition, and consider your path forward. That seems sensible, Margaret agreed, relief mingling with a new sense of responsibility. She might soon be a property owner, something she had never imagined possible. After finalizing arrangements with Judge Harmon and leaving her letters as evidence, Margaret and Patrick stepped back onto the boardwalk. The morning had progressed into a hot afternoon and the street was busy with wagons and riders. Are you hungry? Patrick asked. The hotel serves a decent midday meal. Actually, Margaret said, I'd like to see the Blackstone Ranch. Is it far? Patrick looked surprised. No, it borders my property to the south. We could be there in less than an hour. Then that's what I'd like to do. She met his eyes steadily. If I'm to make decisions about this property, I should at least see it first. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right. Let's get some provisions from the general store first. We might be out longer than planned. As they walked down the boardwalk toward the store, Margaret couldn't help noticing the curious glances directed their way. Several people nodded to Patrick or called greetings, their eyes inevitably sliding to Margaret with undisguised interest. Word travels fast, Patrick murmured, echoing his comment from the day before. I'm beginning to understand that, Margaret replied, holding her head high despite her discomfort under the scrutiny. In the general store, Patrick efficiently gathered some bread, cheese, and dried beef, along with a bottle of sarsaparilla. The storekeeper, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers, beamed at Margaret. You must be the lady who came to marry William Blackstone, he said, wrapping their purchases. Terrible shame about his passing. Fine man, William. Thank you, Margaret said, unsure how else to respond to this blunt acknowledgement of her situation. Here you might be staying on, though. The storekeeper continued, looking between her and Patrick with undisguised curiosity. Nothing's decided yet, Hiram, Patrick said firmly, counting out coins for their purchases. Miss Newsom only arrived yesterday. Outside again, Margaret sighed. Is everyone going to be discussing my business? Patrick helped her mount Daisy before replying. For a while, yes. New arrivals are rare enough. New arrivals with your circumstances are practically unheard of. Wonderful, she muttered, settling into the saddle. Patrick grinned up at her, the expression transforming his usually serious face. It's not all bad. Being known means being looked after. No one will let you starve or freeze, even if you decide to take on the Blackstone place. There was something reassuring in his words, despite the daunting prospect of becoming the subject of town gossip. As they rode out of Delta, Margaret found herself wondering again about Patrick Evans. He seemed genuinely concerned for her welfare, yet there was a reserve about him, a careful distance he maintained. They rode south, following the course of the Uncompahgre River before turning onto a smaller trail that led through stands of cottonwood and willow. The landscape here was less developed than around the Evans Ranch, with wilder growth and fewer signs of human management. "This is Blackstone land now," Patrick said as they passed through a sagging gate. "About 400 acres, running from the river up into those foothills." He pointed west to where the land rose more dramatically. The trail widened into a clearing where a modest house stood single-story, built of logs and local stone, with a porch across the front. Nearby were a small barn, a corral, and what appeared to be a shearing shed. All showed signs of neglect: weathered wood, a broken window in the house, weeds growing up around the foundations. Margaret stared at the homestead, emotions churning inside her. This was where she was supposed to have lived as William Blackstone's wife. This isolated, run-down place was to have been her home. "It's seen better days," Patrick said quietly, dismounting and moving to help her down. "But the bones are good. William built solid." Margaret accepted his assistance, oddly conscious of his hands at her waist. Once on the ground, she moved toward the house, drawn by a need to see inside this place that might soon be hers. The front door was locked, but Patrick found a key hanging from a nail under the porch eave. "William always kept it here," he explained, unlocking the door. "Old habits from when people still needed to seek shelter in emergencies." The interior was dim and dusty but surprisingly orderly. Simple furniture, a table and chairs, a sideboard, a desk in one corner, a stone fireplace with a rocking chair beside it filled the main room. 2 doors led off to what Margaret assumed were bedrooms. She moved slowly through the space, trying to imagine living here. It was smaller than the Evans home, but still substantial by the standards she was used to in Boston. With cleaning and some repairs, it could be comfortable. "What do you think?" Patrick asked from the doorway where he stood watching her exploration. Margaret ran her fingers over the solid oak table. "It's not what I expected. It's—" She struggled to find the right word. "It has character. It feels like someone built it with care." William did most of the work himself over the years. Started with just a one-room cabin, added on as he prospered. "You knew him well." Patrick moved into the room, examining a crack in one window. "Well enough. He kept to himself mostly, but we helped each other when needed." "That's how it works out here." Margaret nodded, understanding beginning to dawn. Community meant something different here than it had in Boston. There, neighbors might live inches apart yet never speak. Here, miles separated homes, but connections seemed stronger, more essential. "Would you show me the rest of the property?" she asked. They spent the next hour exploring the Blackstone Ranch, the empty barn with its stalls and storage loft, the shearing shed where William had processed wool from his now-sold sheep, the small but well-designed irrigation system that channeled water from a creek to fields that now lay fallow. "It has potential," Patrick admitted as they sat on a fallen log near the creek, sharing the provisions he'd bought in town. "The water rights alone make it valuable, and the grazing land is good." Margaret bit into a piece of cheese, considering his words. But it would take money to make it productive again. Money I don't have. There are options. He took a swig from the sarsaparilla bottle before passing it to her. You could sell outright, use the proceeds to return east or establish yourself elsewhere. Or you could seek a partner. Someone with capital or livestock to contribute. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Are you offering Mr. Evans? A faint flush colored his cheekbones. I'm suggesting possibilities, Miss Newsom. Crossbar could expand our herd if we had access to this grazing land. I see. She took a delicate sip from the bottle, oddly disappointed by his businesslike response. And would this hypothetical partnership involve me continuing to live here? That would be up to you. Some partnerships are purely financial. Others. He trailed off, his eyes meeting hers briefly before looking away. The unspoken implication hung in the air between them. Margaret felt her own face warming and quickly changed the subject. Tell me about the area. What's the winter like? How far is the nearest neighbor besides your family? Patrick seemed relieved by the shift to safer topics. They talked as they finished their simple meal about the seasonal patterns of the valley, the community of ranchers and farmers that dotted the landscape, the challenges and rewards of life in this remote corner of Colorado territory. As the afternoon waned, they packed up and prepared to return to the Evans Ranch. Before mounting, Margaret took one last look at the Blackstone house, silhouetted against the western hills. I never expected any of this, she said softly. When I left Boston, I thought I knew exactly what awaited me. Patrick adjusted Daisy's cinch before offering Margaret a hand up. Life rarely gives us what we expect, Miss Newsom. Sometimes it gives us something better. Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary as she settled into the saddle. Margaret found herself wondering if he was speaking from experience and what unexpected turns his own life had taken. The ride back to Crossbar was quieter, each lost in their own thoughts as the shadows lengthened across the valley. When they arrived, Emma was waiting anxiously on the porch. There you are. I was beginning to worry. She hurried down the steps as quickly as her condition allowed. What did Judge Harmon say? And where have you been all day? Patrick explained as he helped Margaret dismount, summarizing their meeting with the judge and their visit to the Blackstone Ranch. Emma's eyes widened. So you might own the property. Margaret, that's wonderful news. It's complicated, Margaret demurred, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. There are debts, repairs needed. Nothing that can't be solved, Emma declared with characteristic optimism. Come inside. You must be exhausted and supper's nearly ready. After a hearty meal of venison stew and cornbread, Margaret excused herself early, pleading fatigue. In the privacy of her room, she sat by the window, staring out at the star-filled sky as she tried to make sense of her rapidly changing circumstances. 2 days ago, she had been Margaret Newsom, spinster seamstress from Boston, traveling to marry a stranger. Now she was potentially a property owner in Colorado territory, with decisions to make that would shape the rest of her life. And then there was Patrick Evans. She had tried all day to ignore the growing awareness she felt in his presence, the way her pulse quickened when their eyes met, the warmth that spread through her when he smiled. It was foolish, she knew. She had just lost her intended husband, and Patrick had shown no indication of interest beyond neighborly concern and perhaps business opportunity. Yet something about him called to her. His quiet strength, his obvious love for this wild, beautiful land, the gentleness that tempered his frontier toughness. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret. Emma's voice came through the wood. May I speak with you a moment, of course? Margaret crossed to open the door. Emma stood in the hallway, a folded quilt in her arms. I thought you might want an extra blanket. The nights can get cool, even in summer." "Thank you." Margaret accepted the quilt, suspecting the blanket was merely a pretext for conversation. Emma confirmed this by asking, "May I come in?" "Just for a minute." Margaret stepped aside, allowing the pregnant woman to enter. Emma lowered herself carefully onto the room's single chair while Margaret sat on the edge of the bed. "I wanted to ask how you're really doing," Emma said, her expression kind but searching. "This must all be overwhelming for you," Margaret sighed, grateful for the woman's perceptiveness. "It is. Everything has happened so quickly. 2 days ago I was certain of my future. Now—" She gestured helplessly. "Now you have choices," Emma supplied. "Difficult ones perhaps, but your own." "Yes." Margaret smoothed the quilt on her lap. "I never expected to own property. Women rarely do, especially women in my position. It's different out here," Emma said. "The rules aren't quite so rigid. People are judged more by what they do than who they are or where they came from. Your brother said something similar." A knowing look crossed Emma's face. "Did he?" "Patrick doesn't usually share his philosophies with strangers." Margaret felt herself blushing. "We had quite a bit of time to talk today. He took you to the Blackstone place." "Yes, it needs work, but I can see why Mr. Blackstone was proud of it." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "William built it from nothing, just like our father did with Cross Bar." She leaned forward slightly. "May I offer some advice, Margaret, woman to woman, please? Don't be too quick to decide anything. Give yourself time to know this place, these people. The land changes with the seasons, so do our hearts." There was something in Emma's tone that made Margaret wonder if she was speaking from experience. "Did you always want this life, running a ranch so far from everything?" Emma smiled, one hand resting on her rounded belly. "No. I was 17 when our parents brought us west. I cried for months, missing St. Louis, my friends, the dances and parties. I was certain I would die of boredom or be scalped by Indians." She laughed at the memory. "Then I met Thomas, who'd come west after the war. He taught me to see the beauty here, the freedom. Now I can't imagine living anywhere else. And your brother, has he always loved it here, Patrick?" Emma's expression softened. "He took to it from the first day. It was as if he'd found the place he was meant to be." She studied Margaret's face. "He doesn't open up easily, you know. Lost someone in the war, a girl he'd planned to marry. She couldn't wait for him, married someone else while he was fighting. I'm sorry to hear that. It was years ago, but it changed him, made him more careful with his feelings." Emma pushed herself up from the chair. "I should let you rest. Just remember what I said. Take your time. The right path has a way of making itself clear." After Emma left, Margaret prepared for bed, her mind replaying their conversation. The revelation about Patrick's past added a new dimension to her understanding of him, the reserve he maintained, the careful way he held himself apart. As she slipped beneath the covers, Margaret found herself wondering if she would ever know the full measure of Patrick Evans. And why, after just 2 days, she so desperately wanted to. The next week passed in a blur of activity as Margaret settled into life at Cross Bar. Emma welcomed her help with household tasks, teaching her the rhythms and routines of ranch life. Margaret learned to cook on a wood-burning stove, to preserve vegetables from the garden, to manage the endless laundry generated by ranch work. In the evenings, she often sat on the porch with the family, listening to stories of the early days in the valley or joining in games of checkers with Thomas. Patrick was frequently absent, busy with ranch work that kept him out until after dark, but when he did join them, Margaret was acutely aware of his presence, the low rumble of his laugh, the thoughtful way he listened to others speak, the occasional glances he sent her way when he thought she wasn't looking. On the 8th day after her arrival, Patrick found her hanging laundry in the yard behind the house. He approached with an air of purpose, his hat in his hands. "Miss Newsom, do you have a moment?" Margaret secured a sheet to the line before turning to him. "Of course, Mr. Evans. I'm riding over to the Blackstone place today to check on some fencing along our shared boundary. I thought you might want to come along, see the property again." He hesitated, "and perhaps discuss some possibilities for its future." Margaret's heart quickened at both the invitation and the implication that he had been thinking about her situation. "I'd like that. Let me just finish this laundry and change into something more suitable for riding." An hour later, they were following the now familiar trail toward the Blackstone Ranch. The day was clear and hot, with a light breeze carrying the scent of sage and sun-warmed earth. Margaret felt more comfortable on horseback now, having ridden several times around the Evans property with Emma as her patient instructor. "You're becoming a natural," Patrick observed as she guided Daisy confidently around a rocky outcropping. "Hardly," Margaret laughed. "But I'm less likely to fall off, at least." They reached the Blackstone property and rode directly to the boundary fence Patrick had mentioned. Several sections had indeed fallen into disrepair, with posts leaning and wire sagging. "This needs fixing before winter," Patrick said, dismounting to examine the damage more closely. "Otherwise, cattle could wander between properties when the snow drifts high enough to cover the lower wires." Margaret stayed on Daisy, watching as he tested the stability of one post. "Would you be willing to handle the repairs? I could pay you if the property becomes mine officially." Patrick looked up at her. "I'd be happy to help regardless, but that brings me to what I wanted to discuss with you." He straightened, dusting his hands on his jeans. "I've been thinking about your situation." "Oh," Margaret tried to keep her tone neutral, though her pulse jumped at his serious expression. "I spoke with Judge Harmon again yesterday while you were helping Emma with canning. The territorial court has agreed to expedite your claim, given the circumstances. You should have legal ownership within 2 weeks." "That's wonderful news," Margaret said, genuinely pleased but also aware that ownership brought responsibility she wasn't sure she was ready for. "Thank you for your help with that." Patrick nodded, seeming almost nervous, a state she hadn't seen in him before. "There's more. I've drawn up a proposal for a partnership, between you and Crossbar, I mean." He reached into his saddlebag and retrieved a folded document which he handed up to her. Margaret opened it curiously, finding a neatly written agreement outlining terms for joint operation of the Blackstone Ranch. "You'd retain ownership of the land," Patrick explained as she read. "Crossbar would provide cattle to graze here, plus labor for maintenance and improvements. We'd split the proceeds from cattle sales, with a larger percentage going to you initially to help clear the outstanding debts." Margaret scanned the document, impressed by its fairness and clarity. "This is very generous, Mr. Evans." "It's practical," he corrected, though a faint flush suggested her approval pleased him. "Both properties benefit. You get immediate income without having to sell, and we get expanded grazing land without having to purchase outright. And where would I live? Would I stay at Crossbar or—" "That would be your choice." He met her eyes directly. "The agreement includes funds to make the Blackstone house habitable again, if you choose to live there, or arrangements could be made for you to remain at Crossbar while still maintaining your independence." Margaret folded the document carefully. "This is a lot to consider. Would you mind if I took some time to think about it?" "Of course not. It's an important decision." He hesitated, then added, "There's no pressure, Miss Newsom. If you decide you'd rather sell and return east or pursue other options, I'll understand completely." The thought of leaving, of never seeing Patrick or his family again, created a sharp pang in Margaret's chest that surprised her with its intensity. "I haven't decided to leave," she said quickly. "I just need to be sure I'm making the right choice for my future," he nodded, seeming relieved. "That's all anyone can ask." Changing the subject, he gestured toward the house. "Would you like to see inside again? I brought tools to fix that broken window." They spent the next 2 hours at the Blackstone house, Patrick repairing the window and checking the roof for leaks, while Margaret explored more thoroughly. The house had 3 rooms, the main living area she'd seen before, a modestly sized bedroom, and a smaller room that might have been intended as a study or perhaps a child's room. A lean-to kitchen extended from the back, with a hand pump that brought water directly from a well. Margaret found herself imagining how the place might look with curtains at the windows, rugs on the floors, a garden outside the kitchen door. It was a surprisingly appealing vision, despite the isolation. When Patrick finished his repairs, they sat on the front porch steps, sharing water from his canteen and looking out over the land that stretched before them. "It's beautiful here," Margaret said softly. "Even more so than I realized on our first visit." Patrick nodded. "William chose well. This valley catches light differently than the rest of the area, something about the angle of the hills. Do you think he was happy here? Alone, I mean." Patrick considered the question seriously. "Content, maybe. William was never what you'd call a joyful man. But he took satisfaction in what he built." He glanced at her. "He must have been lonely, though, to have sought a bride after all those years alone." "Yes." Margaret traced the grain of the wooden step with one finger. "I've been wondering about that. Why me? Why a woman from thousands of miles away, when surely there were unmarried women closer, fewer than you might think? Women are scarce out here." Patrick seemed to choose his next words carefully. "And William was particular. He valued education, refinement. Your letters must have shown those qualities." "My letters," Margaret echoed with a small smile. "I spent hours on each one trying to present myself honestly but favorably. I wanted so badly to escape Boston, to start fresh. And now, what do you want now?" The directness of the question startled her. Margaret looked up to find Patrick watching her intently, his green eyes serious in the afternoon light. "I want—" She faltered, suddenly unsure. The practical answer would be security, independence, a chance to build something lasting. But in that moment, with Patrick so close beside her, other desires pressed against her heart connection, belonging, the particular warmth she felt only in his presence. "I want to find my place," she finished simply. "Somewhere I truly belong." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes. "I understand that," he said quietly. "It's what most of us are looking for in the end." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Then Patrick rose abruptly, breaking the spell. "We should head back. Emma will worry if we're not home by supper." Home. The word hung in the air as Margaret accepted his hand to help her up. Cross Bar had begun to feel like home with a speed that surprised her. But was that because of the place itself, or the people who lived there? The ride back was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts as the shadows lengthened across the valley. When they reached Cross Bar, Thomas was in the yard, looking concerned. "There you are," he called as they approached. "Emma's been asking for you, Margaret. She's feeling poorly." Margaret dismounted quickly, handing Daisy's reins to Patrick. "What's wrong? Is it the baby? She says it's just fatigue, but she seems feverish to me. She's in bed and won't let me fetch the doctor." "I'll go to her," Margaret said, hurrying toward the house. Behind her, she heard Patrick telling Thomas he would ride for the doctor regardless of Emma's protests. She found Emma in bed, her face flushed and eyes too bright. When Margaret laid a hand on her forehead, the skin was hot to the touch. You have a fever, Margaret said, concern tightening her chest. Thomas is worried and so am I. It's nothing, Emma insisted weakly. Just overdid things in the garden yesterday. Patrick's gone for the doctor. Margaret moved to pour water from the pitcher on the bedside table. Here, drink this while I get a cool cloth for your head. Emma accepted the water but caught Margaret's wrist as she turned to leave. If something happens, nothing's going to happen, Margaret interrupted firmly. You're just overheated and tired. If something happens, Emma repeated, promise you'll look after them, Patrick and Thomas. They act strong, but they need someone. The desperation in Emma's voice frightened Margaret more than the fever. You'll be fine, Emma. The doctor will know what to do. Emma's grip tightened. Promise me, Margaret. I promise, Margaret said, recognizing that agreement was the quickest way to calm the agitated woman. But you're going to be perfectly all right. She bathed Emma's face and neck with cool water, changed her into a fresh nightgown, and sat beside the bed until the sick woman drifted into a restless sleep. By then, darkness had fallen and lamps had been lit downstairs. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face drawn with worry. How is she? Sleeping now, but still feverish. Has Patrick returned with the doctor? Not yet. It's a fair distance to town. He moved to his wife's side, laying a gentle hand on her cheek. I shouldn't have let her work so hard in this heat. You couldn't have stopped her, Margaret said, recognizing from her short acquaintance with Emma that the woman was as determined as she was kind. They took turns sitting with Emma through the long night. It was past midnight when the sound of horses in the yard brought Margaret to the window. Patrick had returned with Dr. Wilson, a weathered man of about 60 who moved with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to night calls. After examining Emma, the doctor's diagnosis was reassuring. Heat exhaustion, most likely, complicated by her condition. No signs of childbed fever or serious illness. Rest, plenty of fluids and cooling baths should bring the fever down. The relief in the house was palpable. Thomas stationed himself permanently at Emma's bedside, while Patrick and Margaret retreated to the kitchen to prepare coffee and a meal for the doctor before his return journey. You look exhausted, Patrick said as Margaret stoked the stove. You should rest. I can manage this. I'm fine, she insisted, though her eyes burned with fatigue. I'm used to long nights. The dress shop often had rush orders that kept us working until dawn. Patrick studied her face in the lamplight. You're a remarkable woman, Miss Newsom. The simple statement, delivered in his straightforward manner, warmed something inside her. Not remarkable, just practical. No, he said softly. Remarkable. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. Margaret, the doctor's entrance interrupted whatever Patrick had been about to say. Coffee smells good, Wilson announced, oblivious to the moment he'd broken. Nothing like a hot cup before a cold ride home. Margaret busied herself pouring coffee and slicing bread and cheese for the doctor's journey, aware of Patrick's eyes following her movements. Whatever he had intended to say remained unspoken as they focused on the doctor's needs and Emma's care. By dawn, Emma's fever had broken, and she slept peacefully with Thomas dozing in a chair beside her bed. Margaret, finally yielding to exhaustion, retired to her room, falling into a deep sleep almost as soon as her head touched the pillow. When she woke, the sun was high, suggesting it was well past noon. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, feeling guilty for sleeping so long when there was work to be done. In the kitchen, she found Patrick at the table, papers spread before him as he made notations in a ledger. He looked up when she entered, a smile warming his face. There you are. I was beginning to think you might sleep the day away. I'm so sorry, she began, embarrassed. I didn't mean to, you needed the rest, he interrupted gently. Emma's much better. She's had broth and tea and her fever's completely gone. Thomas is still with her. Relief washed through Margaret. That's wonderful news. It is, he gestured to the stove. There's coffee still hot and biscuits in the warming oven. I made them myself, so lower your expectations accordingly. Margaret laughed, touched by his consideration. I'm sure they're perfectly fine. She poured herself coffee and retrieved a biscuit, which was indeed slightly overdone but perfectly edible. Thank you for this. Least I could do. He cleared space at the table for her to sit. You were remarkable last night, taking charge of Emma's care, keeping everyone calm. Anyone would have done the same, perhaps, but not everyone would have done it with such grace. He closed the ledger, his expression turning serious. Emma's illness has made me think about a lot of things. Margaret sipped her coffee, waiting for him to continue. Life out here is uncertain, he said slowly. We like to think we're in control, that we can plan everything, but the truth is anything can happen at any time. Illness, accident, weather. He trailed off, looking past her to the window. It makes a man consider what's truly important. And what have you concluded? Margaret asked, her heart beating a little faster at his introspective mood. His eyes returned to her face. That connections matter. People matter. More than land or cattle or money. I think that's true anywhere, she said softly, but perhaps more evident here where those connections can mean the difference between survival and... She didn't finish the thought. Patrick nodded, understanding her implication. Exactly. He hesitated, then reached across the table to touch her hand lightly. Margaret, I've been meaning to tell you. The kitchen door swung open, and Thomas entered, looking weary but relieved. Emma's asking for you, Margaret. Says she needs to thank you properly for looking after her. Patrick withdrew his hand, the moment broken once again. You should go. I need to check on the herd anyway. As Margaret stood, she felt a flicker of frustration at the interrupted conversation. Twice now, Patrick had seemed on the verge of saying something important, only to be interrupted. She wondered what it might have been, and whether he would find another opportunity to speak his mind. In Emma's room, she found her friend looking pale but much improved, propped up against pillows with her hands resting on her rounded belly. There you are, Emma said with a weak smile. I'm told you played nurse all night. Thank you. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed. Anyone would have done the same. How are you feeling? Better. Foolish for scaring everyone. Emma captured Margaret's hand. Thomas says I was talking nonsense last night, making you promise things. You were worried, that's all. Emma studied her face. I meant it, though, about Patrick and Thomas needing someone to look after them. Her gaze was surprisingly direct. Especially Patrick. Margaret felt herself blushing under Emma's scrutiny. Your brother is quite capable of looking after himself, I think. In practical ways, yes, but not here. Emma touched her own heart. He closes himself off, has ever since Caroline jilted him during the war. You mentioned that before, Margaret said carefully. It must have been very painful for him. Emma nodded. He came back changed, harder, more cautious. He puts everything into the ranch, works from dawn until dark, rarely takes time for himself. Her expression softened. Until recently. Recently, since you arrived. Emma squeezed Margaret's hand. I've seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching, how he finds reasons to be wherever you are. Margaret's heart fluttered. I'm sure you're mistaken. Mr. Evans has been kind, nothing more. Emma smiled knowingly. If you say so. She leaned back against her pillows, suddenly looking tired. I should rest. But think about what I've said, Margaret. My brother is a good man, the best I know. He deserves happiness. The conversation left Margaret unsettled. She had tried to ignore her growing feelings for Patrick, telling herself it was too soon, too complicated. She was still legally bound to the memory of William Blackstone, still trying to find her footing in this new world. Yet Emma's words had given voice to hopes she'd barely acknowledged to herself. The next few days passed in a whirl of activity. Emma recovered quickly, though Thomas and Patrick insisted she rest more than usual. Margaret took on additional household duties, finding satisfaction in the rhythms of ranch life. She learned to make bread in the large wood-burning oven, to churn butter, to preserve the summer vegetables flooding in from the garden. Patrick was often absent, busy with ranch work that kept him in the fields from dawn until dusk. When their paths did cross, there was a new awareness between them, a careful politeness that hadn't existed before, as if both were conscious of having nearly stepped across some invisible boundary. 5 days after Emma's illness, a letter arrived from Judge Harmon. The territorial court had approved Margaret's claim to the Blackstone property with remarkable speed, influenced perhaps by the judge's personal knowledge of the situation. She was now officially the owner of the ranch, along with all its assets and obligations. "Congratulations, landowner," Emma teased when Margaret shared the news at supper. "How does it feel?" "Overwhelming," Margaret admitted. "I still can't quite believe it." "We should celebrate," Thomas declared. "First round of haying is finished. Why not have a small gathering? Invite the Andersons and Millers, maybe Judge Harmon if he can make the trip." Emma brightened at the suggestion. "A proper party. We haven't had one since Christmas." "Oh, Margaret, you'll finally meet more of the neighbors, and we could announce the partnership with Patrick." Margaret glanced at Patrick, who had been unusually quiet during the meal. "We haven't actually finalized any agreement yet. But you're considering it?" Thomas asked. "Yes," Margaret said cautiously. "It seems the most practical solution." Patrick met her eyes across the table. "Practical," he echoed, something unreadable in his expression. "Yes, I suppose it is." Later that evening, as Margaret helped clear the supper dishes, Patrick approached her in the kitchen. "Could we talk? Outside, perhaps?" The night was clear and cool, with a half-moon illuminating the ranch yard. They walked in silence toward the corral, where several horses dozed or moved quietly in the darkness. "You've been avoiding me," Margaret said finally, unable to bear the tension any longer. Patrick sighed, leaning against the corral fence. "Not intentionally. I've had a lot to think about. The partnership, among other things." He turned to face her, his features half hidden in shadow. "Are you still considering it, the agreement I proposed?" "Yes, it seems sensible, as I said, but I sense you have reservations now." He was quiet for a long moment. "I drafted that agreement before Emma's illness, before I realized some things." Margaret's heart quickened. "What things?" Instead of answering directly, Patrick asked, "Have you been to church since arriving in Delta?" The question caught her off guard. "No. With everything that's happened, I haven't had the opportunity." "There's a service in town tomorrow. Would you ride in with me? There's something important I'd like to discuss, and it might be easier on neutral ground, away from the ranch." Curiosity mingled with apprehension in Margaret's chest. "Of course, if you think it's important." "I do." He straightened, his expression serious in the moonlight. "More important than I realized." They stood facing each other, the night air charged with unspoken words. Then Patrick stepped back, breaking the moment. "We should head back. Early start tomorrow for church." As they walked toward the house, Margaret wondered what could possibly be so important that Patrick needed the formality of church and town to discuss it. Whatever it was, she sensed it would change things between them, perhaps irrevocably. Sunday dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for the ride into town. Margaret wore her best dress, a modest navy blue with white collar and cuffs, and arranged her hair carefully. Whatever Patrick wanted to discuss, she intended to meet it with dignity. When she came downstairs, he was waiting in the main room, dressed in what she recognized as his Sunday best clean dark trousers, a white shirt, and a vest she hadn't seen before. He had shaved closely, and his usually unruly hair was neatly combed. "You look lovely," he said, his eyes warming as they took in her appearance. "Thank you. You're quite presentable yourself." The teasing words helped ease her nervousness. Emma and Thomas had decided to remain home, Emma still recovering her strength and Thomas unwilling to leave her side. This meant Margaret and Patrick would be traveling alone, a fact that seemed to increase the significance of the journey. The ride to town was pleasant, with Patrick pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area's early settlement. Margaret found herself relaxing despite her anticipation of their upcoming conversation. Delta's small church stood at the edge of town, a simple white painted structure with a modest steeple. As they approached, Margaret could see other wagons and horses already gathered, with families in their Sunday clothes greeting each other in the yard. Patrick helped her down from the wagon and offered his arm to escort her inside. Margaret was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way as they entered the church. News of her arrival and circumstances had clearly spread throughout the community. The service was simple but heartfelt, with familiar hymns and a sermon on faith during difficult times that seemed particularly relevant to Margaret's situation. Throughout, she was conscious of Patrick beside her, his deep voice joining in the hymns, his solid presence a comfort in the unfamiliar setting. After the service, there was a social gathering in the churchyard with coffee and baked goods provided by the congregation's women. Patrick introduced Margaret to several neighbors, including the Andersons and Millers whom Thomas had mentioned as potential guests for their celebration. "Miss Newsom is the new owner of the Blackstone Ranch," Patrick explained to Mrs. Miller, a cheerful woman with graying hair and kind eyes. "How wonderful," Mrs. Miller exclaimed. "That property's too good to sit empty. Will you be living there, dear?" Before Margaret could formulate a response, Judge Harmon joined their group. "Miss Newsom, good to see you. I trust you received my letter confirming your claim." "Yes, thank you." "I'm very grateful for your assistance." The judge nodded, pleased. "Glad to help. Actually, I've been meaning to speak with you both. There's a matter concerning the Blackstone property that's come to my attention." Patrick frowned slightly. "What kind of matter?" "Nothing serious," the judge assured them. "Just some paperwork that needs clarification. Perhaps you could stop by my office before you head back to the ranch." After taking their leave of the other churchgoers, Patrick and Margaret made their way to Judge Harmon's office. The judge ushered them into his book-lined sanctuary, closing the door for privacy. "I apologize for the formality," he began, settling behind his desk, "but I've received an inquiry that concerns both of you." Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety. "Is there a problem with my claim?" No. "Your ownership is secure." The judge shuffled through some papers. "The inquiry came from a Mr. James Blackstone of Denver, William's cousin apparently, though William never mentioned him to me." Patrick straightened in his chair. "What does he want?" "He's challenging Miss Newsom's claim to the property. Says he's William's closest living relative and should inherit." Margaret's stomach dropped. "But you said my claim was secure." "It is, legally. The court has recognized your status as William's intended bride and the fulfillment of your agreement by traveling here." The judge leaned forward. "However, Mr. Blackstone seems determined to pursue the matter. He's hired a lawyer in Denver and is threatening litigation." Patrick's expression darkened. This sounds like a money grab. If William had wanted his cousin to have the property, he would have specified that. "I agree," Judge Harmon said. "Unfortunately, without a formal will, there's always room for challenges." I don't think Mr. Blackstone has a strong case, but litigation could be costly and time-consuming. Margaret felt the weight of this new complication settling on her shoulders. What options do I have? The judge considered her question. You could fight it in court. As I said, I believe you would prevail, but it would require legal fees and possibly multiple trips to Denver. Or, Patrick prompted, sensing there was more, or you could settle. Offer a sum to Mr. Blackstone to relinquish any claim. With what money? Margaret asked, frustration coloring her voice. The ranch already has debts I'm struggling to address. Judge Harmon nodded sympathetically. There is a third option, one that would strengthen your position considerably. He glanced between them. Marriage. Margaret blinked, certain she had misheard. I beg your pardon. If you were to marry, the judge explained, your husband would gain legal standing in the matter. A married woman's property becomes her husband's under the law. Mr. Blackstone would be challenging not a single woman of questionable status, but a married couple with established roots in the community. Patrick was very still beside her. You're suggesting Margaret should marry to protect her property. I'm outlining options, the judge corrected. I understand it's unconventional, but these are unusual circumstances. Margaret's mind raced. But who would? She stopped, suddenly understanding the direction of the conversation. She turned to Patrick, who was watching her with an unreadable expression. I believe Mr. Evans has been considering a partnership agreement regarding the property, Judge Harmon said, his tone deliberately casual. A marriage would formalize that arrangement quite effectively. A heavy silence filled the room. Margaret felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her. She had come to church expecting a conversation about business arrangements, only to find herself discussing potential marriage. Patrick cleared his throat. Judge Harmon, would you excuse us for a moment? I'd like to speak with Miss Newsom privately. Of course. The judge rose. I'll wait outside. Take all the time you need. When the door closed behind him, Patrick turned to Margaret, his expression grave. I want to be clear that I knew nothing about this cousin or the judge's suggestion before today. I believe you, Margaret said softly. This is as surprising to you as it is to me. Patrick ran a hand through his hair, disrupting its Sunday neatness. This isn't how I intended our conversation to go. What did you intend? He met her eyes directly. I was going to tell you that I've been reconsidering our partnership agreement, that I've been thinking there might be a better arrangement between us. Margaret's heart stuttered. What kind of arrangement? Patrick rose, moving to stand beside her chair. After a moment's hesitation, he knelt before her, taking her hands in his. Margaret, I know this is sudden. We've known each other barely 2 weeks. But in that time, I've come to admire you more than any woman I've ever met. She stared at him, scarcely able to believe what was happening. Patrick, please let me finish. His hands tightened around hers. When Emma fell ill, I realized how quickly life can change, how precious each day is. I don't want to waste any more time pretending my feelings for you are merely neighborly or businesslike. Margaret could barely breathe as he continued. I was going to ask if you might consider a courtship between us. A proper one, with time for us to know each other better before making permanent decisions. His mouth quirked in a rueful smile. I didn't expect to be proposing marriage today with a judge waiting outside and a property dispute hanging over us. Is that what you're doing? Margaret whispered. Proposing. His green eyes were earnest as they held hers. Yes, not because of the property or this cousin's claim or anything practical, but because I've fallen in love with you, Margaret Newsom. Your courage, your grace, your determination. I want to build a life with you, whether on your ranch or mine or somewhere else entirely. Tears blurred Margaret's vision. Patrick, I hardly know what to say. You don't have to answer now, he said quickly. I understand this is unexpected. We can tell Judge Harmon we need time to consider our options. Margaret shook her head, a smile breaking through her tears. No, I don't need more time. You don't. I came west seeking security and a new beginning. I thought I'd find that with William Blackstone, a man I knew only through letters. She reached to touch Patrick's cheek, her heart full. Instead, I found it with you, a man I've come to know through actions and character, a man who stopped to help a terrified stranger at a train station. Patrick turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. Is that a yes? Yes, Margaret said simply. I'll marry you, Patrick Evans, not for property or legal protection, but because I love you too. The joy that transformed his face was answer enough, even before he leaned forward to capture her lips in a gentle, questioning kiss. Margaret responded with all the certainty she felt, her hands moving to frame his face as the kiss deepened into something that promised a lifetime of happiness. A discreet knock interrupted them. They broke apart, laughing softly at the reminder of the judge waiting outside. I suppose we should let him in, Patrick said, rising and pulling Margaret to her feet. We have a wedding to plan. Judge Harmon was unsurprised by their decision, his eyes twinkling with satisfaction as Patrick formally requested his services for a wedding ceremony. How soon? The judge asked, already pulling out the necessary forms. Patrick looked to Margaret. That's for my fiancé to decide. The word sent a thrill through her. Would next Sunday be too soon? After church? Not too soon at all, Patrick assured her, his smile warming her heart. I've already waited longer than I realized. As they left the judge's office, Margaret felt as if she were floating through a dream. The streets of Delta looked different somehow, brighter and full of promise. Patrick kept her hand firmly in his as they walked back to where they had left their wagon. We'll need to tell Emma and Thomas, Margaret said, her practical nature reasserting itself amid the emotional whirlwind. Patrick laughed. Emma will claim she knew all along. She's been dropping hints about you since the day you arrived. She told me she'd noticed how you looked at me, Margaret admitted, blushing at the memory. Observant woman, my sister. Patrick helped her into the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist. Though I thought I was being more subtle. As they drove back toward Cross Bar, Margaret found herself planning aloud. We'll need to decide where to live, whether to combine the ranches or run them separately. And there's still the matter of Mr. Blackstone's cousin. Patrick reached over to take her hand. We'll figure it all out together. That's what marriage is, facing life's challenges side by side. The simple wisdom of his words touched Margaret deeply. This was why she loved him, his steady strength, his clear-eyed view of the world, his unwavering integrity. Together, she agreed, squeezing his hand. I like the sound of that. When they arrived at Cross Bar, Emma was waiting on the porch, her face lighting up at the sight of their clasped hands as they approached. Finally, she exclaimed, rushing forward as quickly as her condition allowed. Thomas, come quickly. They've come to their senses at last. Thomas appeared in the doorway, grinning at his wife's excitement. I take it congratulations are in order. Patrick put his arm around Margaret's waist, drawing her close. Miss Margaret Newsom has done me the great honor of agreeing to become my wife. Emma embraced them both, tears of joy streaming down her face. I knew it. From the moment you brought her home, Patrick, I knew she was the one for you. When's the wedding? Thomas asked, pumping Patrick's hand enthusiastically. Next Sunday after church, Margaret replied. Judge Harmon will perform the ceremony. So soon? Emma looked surprised. That hardly gives us time to prepare. We don't need anything elaborate, Margaret assured her. Just family and a few close friends. Nonsense, Emma declared. My brother is getting married. We're going to celebrate properly. She linked her arm through Margaret's. Come inside, we have planning to do. As the women disappeared into the house, Thomas clapped Patrick on the shoulder. Happy for you, brother, she's a fine woman. The finest, Patrick agreed, his eyes following Margaret until she vanished through the doorway. I never expected this, you know. When I rode into town that day, I was just going for supplies. Thomas smiled knowingly. Some things are meant to be, I reckon, like me and Emma. Sometimes the right person just walks into your life when you least expect it. Inside, Emma was already making lists, guests to invite, food to prepare, decorations to arrange. Margaret watched with a mixture of amusement and gratitude as her future sister-in-law threw herself into wedding preparations. Nothing too extravagant, Margaret reminded her gently. And remember your health. You're supposed to be resting. Emma waved away her concern. Planning a wedding is hardly strenuous. Besides, this is the happiest news we've had in ages. She paused, studying Margaret's face. You are happy, aren't you? This isn't just about the property dispute. I'm happier than I've ever been, Margaret assured her. The property is the least of it. I love your brother, Emma, more than I thought possible in such a short time. Emma's expression softened. I can see it in your eyes when you look at him, the same way he looks at you. She squeezed Margaret's hand. Welcome to the family, sister. The week leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of activity. Word spread quickly through the valley, and neighbors stopped by regularly with congratulations and offers of help. Margaret was touched by the community's warm acceptance of her, a stranger just weeks ago, now embraced as one of their own. Patrick rode into town to send telegrams to Judge Harmon and several other key guests, while Margaret worked with Emma on preparations for the celebration that would follow the ceremony. The ranch hands were enlisted to clean and decorate the barn, which would serve as the reception venue. On Wednesday, Patrick took Margaret to the Blackstone Ranch, soon to be their ranch, to assess what would be needed to make it habitable for them after the wedding. We can stay at Cross Bar until we get everything in order here, Patrick said as they walked through the house. No rush to move until you're comfortable with the idea. Margaret ran her hand along the mantelpiece, imagining winter evenings by the fire. I'd like to make it ours as soon as possible. It feels right somehow, starting our marriage in our own home. Patrick's eyes warmed at her words. I've been thinking the same thing. He moved to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist. I'll bring some of the men over tomorrow to start repairs. The roof needs work and that back door sticks. Margaret leaned into his embrace, savoring the solid strength of him. I can start cleaning, maybe paint the kitchen. Emma says Mrs. Anderson has extra curtain fabric she's willing to share. Sounds like you have it all planned out, Patrick murmured, his breath warm against her ear. Not everything. She turned in his arms to face him. We still need to decide how to handle the ranches, whether to combine them or keep them separate. Both options have merit. His hands settled at her waist. Combining them would be more efficient, but keeping them separate preserves your independence. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You'd be comfortable with your wife owning property separately. I want you to be my partner in every sense, Margaret. That includes respecting your right to the property you've inherited. His expression grew serious. I'm not marrying you for your land. I hope you know that. I do. She reached up to touch his cheek, rough with the day's growth of beard. Just as I'm not marrying you for your cattle or your water rights. He smiled, turning his head to press a kiss to her palm. Good. Because I come with complications, a bossy sister, a brother-in-law who snores loud enough to wake the dead, and ranch hands who can't cook to save their lives. Margaret laughed. I think I can handle those complications. Their lips met in a kiss that started gently but quickly deepened, hinting at the passion they would soon be free to express fully. When they finally broke apart, Both were breathing faster, their faces flushed. "Sunday seems very far away," Patrick murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "5 days," Margaret agreed, "but then a lifetime together." Friday brought a letter from Denver. Judge Harmon delivered it personally to Cross Bar, his expression grave as he handed it to Margaret. "It's from James Blackstone's attorney," he explained as Margaret opened the envelope. "I thought it best you see it immediately." The letter was formal and threatening, detailing James Blackstone's intent to challenge Margaret's claim to the Blackstone property through all legal means available. The attorney hinted at moral impropriety in her arrangement with William, suggested fraud in her claim of betrothal, and demanded immediate surrender of the property to avoid costly litigation. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she handed the letter to Patrick. "He seems determined." Patrick scanned the document, his jaw tightening. "This is intimidation, nothing more. He's hoping to frighten you into giving up without a fight." Judge Harmon nodded agreement. "Standard tactics, but your marriage on Sunday will significantly strengthen your position." I took the liberty of writing to the territorial court, informing them of the upcoming union. "They've assured me that Mr. Blackstone's claim will be given little weight once you're married." "So this is an empty threat?" Margaret asked, wanting to be certain. "Not entirely empty," the judge cautioned. "He could still pursue litigation, but his chances of success would be minimal. More likely, he'll seek a settlement once he realizes his position has weakened." "We won't be bullied," Patrick stated firmly, his arm going around Margaret's shoulders. "If he wants to negotiate reasonably, we'll listen. Otherwise, he can take his chances in court." After the judge departed, Patrick found Margaret on the porch, staring out at the mountains with a troubled expression. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, settling beside her on the bench. "About marrying you? Never." She turned to face him. "But I hate that our marriage might be seen as a legal maneuver rather than what it truly is." Patrick took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "What other people think doesn't matter. We know the truth." "Yes," Margaret agreed, drawing strength from his certainty. "We do." Sunday dawned clear and perfect, as if nature itself approved of the union about to take place. Margaret woke early, too excited to sleep, and found Emma already in the kitchen, preparing a special breakfast despite Margaret's protests that she should be resting. "It's my brother's wedding day," Emma insisted, her condition seemingly forgotten in her enthusiasm. "And my new sister's. I'm not spending it in bed." After breakfast, as the men retreated to prepare themselves, Emma helped Margaret dress in her wedding gown, a simple but elegant creation of ivory silk that they had altered from one of Emma's dresses. With her hair arranged in soft curls and a small crown of wildflowers that Emma had gathered at dawn, Margaret hardly recognized the woman who looked back at her from the mirror. "You're beautiful," Emma said softly, adjusting the flowers. "Patrick won't be able to take his eyes off you." Margaret smiled, her heart full. "I can't believe this is happening. 2 weeks ago I was alone on a train platform, terrified of what awaited me. And now I'm home," Margaret said simply, "truly home for the first time in my life." The small church in Delta was filled beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out onto the porch. It seemed the entire community had turned out to witness Patrick Evans marry the Eastern woman who had arrived so unexpectedly in their midst. Thomas escorted Margaret down the aisle, where Patrick waited beside Judge Harmon. The look on Patrick's face when he saw her a mixture of awe, joy, and love so profound. It seemed to illuminate him from within was one Margaret knew she would remember until her dying day. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. They exchanged simple vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other through all of life's joys and sorrows. When Judge Harmon pronounced them husband and wife, Patrick's kiss was both tender and possessive, a promise of the life they would build together. The celebration afterward was everything a Western wedding should be: abundant food, music from local fiddlers, dancing that continued well into the evening. Margaret moved through it all in a happy daze, accepting congratulations from neighbors who had been strangers just days before, dancing with her new husband under lanterns strung from the barn rafters. As the evening waned, Patrick drew her outside, away from the noise and festivity. In the quiet of the summer night, with stars scattered like diamonds across the vast sky, he took her in his arms. "Happy, Mrs. Evans?" he asked, his voice husky with emotion. "Completely," she assured him, her hands resting on his chest. "Though I still can't quite believe it's real. It's real." He touched her cheek gently. "You're my wife, I'm your husband, and tomorrow we start our life together." "At the Blackstone place?" Margaret asked, having not yet heard which option he had chosen. "At our home," Patrick corrected softly. "I had the men working there all week while you were busy with wedding preparations. It's not perfect yet, but it's ready for us." Joy welled up in Margaret's heart. "You did that for me, for us," he said, drawing her closer. "Everything I do from now on is for us." Their lips met in a kiss that sealed their commitment, their love, their future. As they stood beneath the endless western sky, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world, not in Boston, not in William Blackstone's empty house, but here, in Patrick Evans's arms, in this wild, beautiful land that had become her home. Epilogue. 5 years later, Margaret Evans stood on the porch of their home, watching the sun set behind the western hills. The golden light bathed the valley in warmth, highlighting the lush pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, and the orchard they had planted in their second year of marriage. The sound of childish laughter drew her attention to the yard, where Patrick was teaching their 3-year-old son, William, to rope a small wooden calf. Beside them, little Emma, not quite 2, clapped her hands in delight at her brother's efforts. "Mama, look!" William called, his face flushed with excitement as the rope settled around the wooden calf's neck. "I did it! Wonderful, darling," Margaret called back, her heart swelling with pride and love. Patrick scooped Emma up with one arm, using the other to guide William toward the house. "I think that's enough practice for today, Cowboy. Time to wash up for supper." As they approached, Margaret marveled at how her life had transformed in 5 short years. The Blackstone Ranch now, the Evans Ranch, had prospered beyond their expectations. They had expanded the house to accommodate their growing family, added new barns and corrals, and increased their cattle herd threefold. The property dispute with James Blackstone had been settled amicably after all, with Patrick offering a small parcel of land and modest cash payment in exchange for full relinquishment of any claim. It had turned out that James was more interested in recognition than wealth, having felt excluded from his cousin's life for many years. The Crossbar Ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's management, with Emma overseeing the financial aspects. Their son, now 4, was the apple of his father's eye and already showing signs of being a natural horseman. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Patrick asked as he reached the porch, setting Emma down to toddle toward her mother. Margaret smiled, lifting her daughter into her arms. "Just how fortunate we are, how far we've come." Patrick nodded, understanding in his eyes. After sending William inside to wash his hands, he joined Margaret on the porch swing, his arms settling comfortably around her shoulders as Emma nestled between them. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Coming west, marrying me instead of William Blackstone?" Margaret turned to face him, surprised by the question after all this time. "Never, not for a single moment," even with all the hardships. The drought last year, the difficult birth with Emma, my mother-in-law's extended visit last spring. His eyes twinkled with humor at the last item. Margaret laughed, remembering how they had finally located her mother, long thought dead, through a series of unexpected coincidences. The reunion had been joyful, but adjustment to her strong-willed parent had tested Patrick's patience severely. Even with all of that, she assured him, "Every day with you is a blessing, Patrick Evans. Every challenge we face together makes us stronger." He leaned forward to press a gentle kiss to her lips, mindful of their daughter watching with wide eyes between them. "I love you, Margaret, more today than yesterday, but not as much as I will tomorrow." "And I love you," she whispered back. "My cowboy who rescued a terrified bride at a train station and changed her life forever." The sound of William's return broke the moment. "Papa, Uncle Thomas is coming. I see his horse." Patrick stood, lifting Emma from Margaret's lap. "Must be important for him to ride over this late. Let's go see what he needs." As her family moved toward the yard to greet her brother-in-law, Margaret lingered a moment on the porch. The setting sun painted the land in shades of gold and amber, the same colors that had first captivated her when she arrived in this valley 5 years ago. She had come west seeking security and a fresh start. What she had found instead was so much more a love beyond anything she had imagined possible, a family of her own, a community that had embraced her, and a home built with love and hard work. Margaret Evans smiled as she moved to join her husband and children. The terrified bride at the train station was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had found not just security, but true belonging in the wild, beautiful West.